To start off the dedicated sorceress segments of the skill guide, we're going to start with a set of skills that had a bunch of drama in the months leading up to 2.4, mostly with people crying foul about a nerf of sorts that was actually just a return to standard behavior to prevent a skill from being overpowered. This is the damage over time branch of the fire tree, with Firewall, Blaze, and Meteor being the big trifecta of the pile, which you usually end up choosing just one to focus on as your fire damage source, since while they are overlapping utility, they have different synergies and point requirements, not to mention you have to wonder how many sources of fire you really need at one time. Starting with the lowest damage and most support-oriented of the three, we have Blaze, which got an overall buff in 2.4 and was made even cheaper to invest in to boot due to an increase in base damage, but removal of the Firewall synergy. Though the big boost wasn't just the damage and point shift, but rather the addition of a faster run walk boost, making it useful in a number of circumstances and also buffing Inferno stride a bit for off-class use. Generally, the uses for this skill are strictly for support purposes, by providing consistent damage while kiting enemies, serving as a secondary damage source for certain builds, and generally being just a solid option for field control, and since it uses auto-spawn on movement rather than a number of missiles per second, you can stack them up even more with new perks by constantly being moving at your new higher speed. The only other use for this, at least in Lord of Destruction since I have not tested it in Resurrected, is messing with spawn mechanics at an exceptionally high level of the skill, though this is a bit fiddly at best in optimal conditions, so your average player will never run into it. And while there is also a bit of an oddity with skills like leap, charge, whirlwind, etc., it's best to just understand that it works while running or walking, not while doing other weird movement techs. Moving on to the big brother though, we have Firewall, which is exactly what it sounds like, a giant wall of fire you summon in front of you that spawns up much in the same way as say the Necromancer's Bone Wall, but instead of being a solid object, this gives you a wall of damage that obstructs nothing. A bug was patched that took the skill from being the flavor of the month and Resurrected to returning it back to its classic use of being a budget fire damage option on dual elemental builds. Namely, the way Firewall stacks was fixed back to how it behaved in older versions of the game to prevent super stacks from being a thing really. As far as raw damage per second, the skill will sit at about double that of Blaze when similarly invested in, but comes with the downside of being a stationary tool, which while great for stationary enemies, means you need to plan your placement a bit whenever you pull it out against enemies that are mobile, or things like melee attackers or enemies with scripts that cause them to reposition frequently. The general strategy is to either park the Firewall near your mercenary to kill the enemies harassing them, or to drop a Firewall down and run along it, to lead enemies across it for as long as possible. Firewalls are of course more effective against larger opponents due to them touching more of the damage points at once, which makes it still a fairly handy use case against act bosses, despite no longer being able to decimate them on players 8 in less time than any other class. The last skill is one that people generally have a love-hate relationship with, and I'm no exception. Namely, I love this skill on keyboard and mouse, but absolutely bloody hate it on controller. This is because, much like Blizzard and Firewall, it is very much an aim and timing dependent skill, and there are a few misunderstandings about how Meteor distributes damage as well. Mainly, it's best to look at it as two parts: the impact, which deals a straight splash fire damage in the area of landing, and is extremely straightforward, and then the burn pattern, which is not the same shape as the explosion, but rather is comprised of very specific scatterings of what essentially amounts to miniature stationary Firewall missiles. Simply put, it is possible for enemies to be in the middle of the impact crater and only take damage from the impact, but not the resulting fires, if they're positioned just right at least. Or they can take exceptional damage from the fires if they're big enough and positioned just wrong for them. The big reason most people are really hit or miss on this skill is because it's a fire and wait skill, requiring you to anticipate enemy movement more than even skills like earlier mentioned Firewall, since you want the target to not only get to the burn, but more important, you want them to get the impact damage as well, which requires them to be in a specific spot at a specific time. The most common strategy for this is just to cast Meteor on your mercenary while they tank, though the more advanced strategies, or heck, situations where you don't have good mercenary equipment to keep them alive, learning to drop and run to hit enemies is a useful skill, which generally means aiming near your own feet, then leading the enemy into the spot by running away, rinse, and repeat. Especially on crowds, it's super effective. So, when you play fire builds, do you prefer these damage over time effects, or do you prefer to smash enemies in the face with reckless abandon with skills like Fireball and Firebolt? Mention it down below, and as always, a special thanks to the channel members, patrons, and subscribers that make this content possible. Last time we covered the damage over time with the Sorceress Fire. Today we look at the more direct approach with the big three: Fireball, Firebolt, and Hydra. These three skills have been popular tools for ages, especially Fireball, though with the release of 2.4, Hydra has finally taken its role as a mainline skill rather than merely support, making this trio a very commonly sought after option for the first time since casting delays were introduced. Starting with the basis of these skills, we have the starter spell Firebolt, an often dismissed spell since, well, it's the level 1 fire damage spell, how useful could it be? The reality is, it sits in an interesting slot thanks to being one of the few damage spells without a scaling cost, but that has a solid synergy option to get it up to decent damage, albeit single target. The main usefulness of this is when fighting bosses or other solo enemies in a situation where you may have mana issues, or simply put, solo self-found runs or budget setups. This is because while once you've got your mid-tier gear like spirits and insight set up, you can get away with using fireballs, but you'd be a fool to pass up a 2.5 mana gut punch to a single target, especially since the other spammable fire options are generally going to be double-digit mana costs for similar amounts of punchiness. So if you're going solo self-found, don't be afraid to keep this on a hot swap for dealing with things like act bosses or small packs of enemies that don't need you bringing out your big guns like Meteor, Fireball, or Hydra. So don't let the fact that it's a level 1 skill hold you back from trying it out in your early builds, especially if you're going boss farming, since at certain higher levels, you actually can end up with it being stronger, for a single target at least, than its big brother Fireball. Speaking of the big brother though, Fireball is still the cornerstone of several builds, and for good reason. It's basically spammable like Firebolt, but it packs splash damage at the cost of, well, costing more mana. On most average uses, it will beat out Firebolt for raw damage, at least outside of those fringe cases we just mentioned earlier. It's just sometimes easier to assign it to the left click and not worry about swapping to maximize efficiency. As far as how it works pretty much like Firebolt in that it launches a projectile at the target and wham bam thank you ma'am, it's done. The big difference though is Fireball has that area of effect splash, which may not seem exceptionally large, but when aimed properly can still, well, properly decimate crowded enemies and deal plenty of damage per second to even justify its use over things like Meteor, especially if you're using a controller. Generally, the only thing you need to watch out for with it, and you'll find this with other splash skills like this, is that it will suck back some serious mana, so you'll want to swap over to it after you've got yourself squared away in regard to stuff like Warmth and Insight to keep you recovering quickly. But once you're there, just stack up that faster cast and go to town. The third skill in this list is Hydra. It's a one-way synergy with the other two, meaning Hydra gets bonuses from them, but it does not provide them back. But with the changes in 2.4, the Hydra is now finally back to being an interesting and actually competitive option. This is because with the patch, they made it so Hydras no longer have a cooldown, but rather they can only be cast up to a certain quantity at once, 6, letting you be much more mobile than in the previous versions of the skill. Now, as far as how the skill works, it's got quite a few quirks. Probably the most important one is to realize that Hydras may be summoned, but in terms of rainbow facets, masteries, and resist penetration, they act as if the sorceress was using the attack that they use. So yes, Hydras will 100% benefit from +% fire damage, fire mastery, and minus enemy fire resist for the sorceress, making them the only summon or construct with that distinction. Beyond that, they function essentially like traps with a timer rather than a shot limit, meaning they can shoot around corners as long as the enemy is in their awareness range, and there's actually 3 of them shooting at any given time, meaning they do 3 times the listed damage if all 3 heads are focused on the same target. Though they do only attack a little under once per second, so you're not going to see a single Hydra machine gunning something down, but a whole group of 6 will easily shred single targets. And I'm glad to see it finally justifying its placement as a capstone skill. So do you have a favorite fire skill? Mention it down below, and if you want to learn about the damage over time competitors in the tree, click the video on screen now, and as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye. While most people focus on the sorceress active skills like Blizzard, Meteor, Lightning, etc., the secret sauce of some of the most broken sorceress builds in the game is hidden away in her passive skill set. So today, let's take a look at the power of a sorceress and what she can muster without ever lifting a finger. Starting with probably the lowest power, but still exceptionally high utility skill, we have Warmth, the personal mana potion available to every sorceress, and while a lot of builds use it strictly as a 1-point wonder, just to save on mana potions, this skill is actually a hidden treasure for a wide array of builds, and has a lot more utility with the changes that have occurred during 2.4. Namely, it serves as a source of boosted mana regeneration for spam builds like Nova, Fireball, and Lightning, but it also serves as a massive source of regeneration for energy shield based builds, essentially giving them ungodly mana regeneration while using that mana as an alternative to their life pool, boosting their survivability far more than any life replenish could hope to achieve. And needless to say, this is a small dog in the sorceress passives and is only going to go up from here. Our second passive skill is our first mastery, and only gets ranked lower than the others due to being a special use case, and that is Cold Mastery. Unlike the other masteries, Cold Mastery is the only resistance penetration mastery, and as such, doesn't have near the amplifying effect as other masteries in other trees, especially since it's unable to break immunities like Conviction or lower resist. This means it only comes into effect when enemies are not immune to cold anymore. The other big limiting factor on this is that resists have an actual floor of negative 100%. This means that no matter how much you load up on this, the most you'll be able to do is double the listed damage. And as such, any levels over 37 are always wasted, and generally you'll find most people aiming for either level 17 or 27 for different reasons, since they are minus 100% and minus 150% respectively. And this is mostly due to how resists are distributed. So outside of some freeze duration impacts or potentially overstacked PvP opponents, there's very little reason to extend to extreme levels in this skill once you account for plus skills. That said, the other two masteries, there is no such issue, and no point you put in them is wasted, especially since they are global boosts, not synergies. Now, starting with Lightning Mastery, which is the least finicky, and the cornerstone of builds like the Dream Sorceress, as well as a handful of niche chance to cast builds, it is the important introduction to how masteries, synergies, and even melee attacks with elemental damage skills, tied to them at least, stack. Starting with the actual synergies, it's important to remember, synergies and masteries are multiplied, so if you have, say, plus 100% from a synergy and 350% from a mastery, and that spell does a base damage of, say, 300 flat, you'll actually end up dealing 2700 damage with it. This is a bit counterintuitive if you're used to martial characters and their damage formulas, but it is one reason some spells can ramp up much harder than others. The other big aspect, and this is key for the Dream Sorceress, is that it boosts all lightning damage. From gear, it only applies once, but from skills, it double dips. This is because it applies to both the base skill damage added, as well as the damage dealt on the actual melee attack, though this is prevented on range, so bow users need not apply. But in short, if you have, say, 1000 damage added to your melee attack by Holy Shock, Mastery will boost it by the 350% we mentioned before, and bring it up to 4500 damage. And whenever you land the blow, it'll bring that up to a whopping 20,250 damage. And that's just from a 1000 base damage. The reality is, a dual Dream Sorceress can have base lightning damage add up to just under 1700 damage. On the other side of the aisle, we have Fire Mastery that operates much the same way and can be used in a few ways, such as bow chantresses or melee enchantresses, both of which are interesting, or even making a somewhat less impressive Dragon Sorceress. And this is a very similar principle to why the Dream Sorceress build works the way it does under Lightning, so similar strategies do apply here. Now, it is worth noting that masteries are restricted from impacting certain skills. For example, Lightning Mastery won't boost Static Field's damage, and similarly, Fire Mastery won't boost Corpse Explosion, or things like the burning damage on Immolation or Molten Boulder, and of course, as expected, the masteries won't impact summons or mercenaries outside of Hydra, of course. This is weirdly selective set, and what it is and is not impacted by in masteries can make it kind of confusing to some new players, but once you have the short list of this does not work with it type deals, you're pretty much free to go wild experimenting with different skills to make weird stuff. Now, while this video may not have been as visually stimulating as some of the others, it is important to remember that just how much of an impact these skills can have. So the question for today's video will mirror the poll from earlier. What is your favorite element in the game and why? And are there any that you particularly hate or love? Mention it down below. And as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye. While the passives are some of the most important skills for the Sorceress, there are a whole slew of support skills that she can actively cast to aid her should you want to run certain non-traditional builds, so over the next few episodes, we're going to hit on these, starting today with the offensive support skills Enchant and Thunderstorm. The reason why these two skills is just because the sheer amount of things people get wrong about them, even to this day. Starting with the more popular one and the cornerstone of several niche builds, such as the Melee Sorceress, Bow Chantress, and even sometimes used for various low-level boosts or team play, we have Enchant, as you could probably have guessed by that second one. Probably. This skill is a lot punchier than you would likely realize at first due to how it interacts with several tools available to the Sorceress, though it is also useful for supporting allies even though it doesn't give quite as big of a boost to them. Starting with the friendly support though, since it's, well, simpler, you basically give your allies a set amount of fire damage to their attacks, a % attack rating boost that gets up to at least a reasonable level, and a really cool red glow on their weapons, at least on players. Though the effects will still apply to summons and mercenaries, you don't get to have the fun graphical change to tell you if it's still active on them or not. But on the Sorceress herself, she's able to take it up a notch since, unlike on allies, she's able to double dip on the fire when doing melee attacks. This means basically the base amount of fire damage added to the attack is ramped up on the skill itself by things like Fire Mastery and Rainbow Facets and the like, and then when melee attacks land, it's ramped up yet again, basically double dipping on the sheer amount of fire damage you can deal because it multiplies it by that percent yet again. Though for the Bow Enchantress, this is sadly not going to happen since ranged attacks are excluded from this double dipping effect due to how strong it was before being patched out. But you may be wondering why that is, and that's because fire damage, yes, even damage from skills like Enchant and Holy Fire, is added to the explosive fire damage of skills like Exploding Arrow and Immolation Arrow, the former of which can be found on several unique bows. Among them, the ever-popular Kukoshikaku bow, which in the early days of Lord of Destruction was able to clear cows at speed on par with Javazons due to this, and a couple of other interesting interactions. Now, even though that's been patched out, there are still a couple oddities worth noting with it, such as there being no penalty for range, so that 1/3 penalty it lists is basically a complete lie, and it doesn't work that way. There's also how the character screen almost never shows the correct damage, but that's just normal for the lying character screen. But for the most part, the rest of the stuff behaves like you'd expect, with higher level beating higher level, so you can't just override a stronger enchant to troll people, and while the actual damage from enchant does start to fall off a bit in hell, when combined with other boosts and the attack rating perk, it can still be made to work just fine. Now, on the other side of the pile, we have Thunderstorm, another skill with a ton of odd myths about it, but that thankfully a lot of them are bullcrap, and the skill is a lot more simple than Enchant's nuanced does and does not boost this and that type setup. And this is mostly because while Thunderstorm doesn't lie in its description, it doesn't tell you everything either. It has a similar highest level wins type deal, but is a bit more finicky about actually needing skill levels for it to stick around, meaning hot swapping just for it, not quite as highly recommended. That said, if you are going to use it, you generally will want high levels of it to begin with, so that means you need to put points in it. This is because unlike skills where they want faster casts, the only thing that impacts the timing between lightning bursts is the level of the skill itself, starting at a bit over 4 seconds between bolts at level 1 and dropping down to a little over a second at more invested levels, ultimately capping out at 1 bolt per second at a whopping level 60, though in more reasonable mid-30 levels, it'll still be close enough to a second for it not to matter too much. Now, the major reason most people don't invest a lot in it outside of novelty's sake is that despite being a semi-passive skill, you're not going to see it really making a drastic change in the battlefield due to its damage really not being updated significantly outside of an added synergy in 2.4 that really still doesn't bring it up to par, since a few thousand damage per second without any aim control doesn't really do much. There's been a few suggestions on how to improve it, but we'll see if any of them come down the pipeline in 2.5 or later. Personally, I'm a fan of either giving it an area of effect on strike or possibly making it a lightning enchant effect of sorts, but until they decide to focus on it, only time will tell the direction they take. Overall, these two skills on the surface don't really fit a direct need currently, but they do provide benefits and are unique in their flavor compared to a lot of other skills, not just on the Sorceress, and that's ignoring their niche uses like the auto-aim of Thunderstorm for some specific PvP builds, or the specialty uses and support role of an Enchantress. So do you enjoy them as is, or would you like to see some changes dropped on them? Mention it down below, and as always, thanks to all the patrons and channel members for keeping this channel afloat. While on one hand you have the offensive support skills like Enchant and Thunderstorm, there are also the defensive support skills that can actually help give the Sorceress a nice set of tools to become a capable tank as well. And today we look at the first 3 of those, Frozen, Shiver, and Chilling Armor, which in addition to providing extra defense, actually have a nice set of side effects as well. Now, as far as what applies to all 3 of these armors, they are cross synergies with each other. Their skill levels and synergies are set when cast, though any mastery or item effects are based on when the hits occur, though the biggest and weirdest global effect that applies to all 3 of them is what they are exclusive to, since while you can use these with Cyclone Armor and Blade Shield, they are not compatible with Bone Armor or any of the other cold armors. So if you're a Necromancer using Fortitude or a Sorceress using Bone, you will find overriding will be a bit of a frustrating issue. But when you do use them, they can be pretty handy, even with the lowest level 1 Frozen Armor being decent. It of course gives the improved defense and such for its duration, but it also puts you in a position to retaliate against melee opponents by freezing them in place when they hit you. And while it does lose effectiveness thanks to duration penalties and higher difficulties, and just generally higher cold and chill resist reducing the duration, at least on the fun side, chill and freeze are separate effects, so if you have a long chill, it will still keep them slowed after they thaw out, and the freeze is super effective at handling small crowds. Moving down the tree though, we give up on the freeze and instead favor chill to go with our defense, starting with Shiver armor, which, while giving fairly decent defense boosts, opts to give us damage retaliation rather than solely control like frozen armor. This means that, like Thorns, it serves a role as a retaliatory damage source as well, and unlike Thorns, it did not wait until 2.4 to do it on attack attempts rather than solely hits. Though, even though it did get a boost in 2.4, it's still strictly secondary amounts of damage, basically meaning you will hurt what hits you, but it's not going to be enough to reasonably kill things itself, at least not later on. Now, at the bottom of the list, we have something similar, but this time ranged, with chilling armor. Again, applying defense, cold damage, and chill, albeit only to ranged attacks. It does get a bit funky whenever you're trying to understand what it means by a ranged attack, especially since there are oddities such as Druid Arctic Blast or even enemy Infernos that don't trigger retaliation missiles, but the Frozen Horror and Neelathak Arctic Blasts actually do trigger them. There is also the weird hidden poison enchanted status that Akmel and Lilith have that can trigger them, even though you cannot see the missiles from the statuses actually hitting you. Needless to say, the list of does and does nots for triggering it can get pretty long and convoluted and would likely be confusing to list off, so instead I will be including a link to the Amazon Basin page down below so you can check it out, but if you're looking for a quick reference, just assume that traps or indirect fire skills won't trigger it, and that it will cover about 80% of the list, since only a few specific direct fire skills don't trigger it. That said, personally, I prefer the last one, chilling armor, but they all have their uses depending on your build and where you're going. And if you're using Fortitude, you will get it for free when hit. So it can be a lot of fun, though unless you're going for a pacifist build, I would recommend against going full tilt into any single one of them, since they can be a lot of points for, well, minimal damage. So stick with using them for defense and chill primarily, and focus on the other skills for the rest of the build. Though if you want some fun ideas for skills that can be used with it, click on the video on screen now, and as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye. To round out the Sorceress support skills, we have a powerhouse that finally works as intended, Energy Shield, which now with some fixes and patches released in 2.4 is able to live up to its reputation as a method of near immortality, well, at least with its key synergy Telekinesis. The reason why this is important is because of fixes made to mana burn in the latest patches, taking it from mostly a PvP skill to something much more interesting. Starting with the support skill Telekinesis, since it's the truly important part of the formula, with no points, Energy Shield will drain 2 mana for every point of damage absorbed, and this can get pretty gnarly, and is one reason I tend to avoid the pure memory staff setups that generate extremely high energy shields without the Telekinesis investment. As you start investing more into Telekinesis though, you will see that the cost of your mana, like taking damage, decreases drastically. It's a little bit over 6% per hard point, reaching a 1-to-1 ratio at 16 hard points. Whenever you invest the full 20 points into it, you actually only lose mana equal to 75% of the damage it absorbed, which can save you a ton. Unfortunately, the other uses of Telekinesis make it a fairly forgotten skill outside of maybe speedrunning, since it does minimal lightning damage, it'll knock back maybe 35% of the time, and in newer versions of the game can only pick up golden consumables, things like potions, arrows, keys, etc. When I do have it on my hot swap, it's mostly because I want to go quick, since it can be used on things like waypoints, shrines, chests, urns, etc., basically touch-to-use items. Though town portals are a bit fiddly with it, only working in specific conditions. That said, with high enough faster cast, it can be a quick barrel clearer, at least compared to kicking, which can be handy in some farming areas. But in the end, its real utility for most people is going to be Energy Shield, though I appreciate it being at least a semi-unique synergy interaction instead of just more plus damage like most of them are. Now, speaking of Energy Shield, the reason this is so interesting is because of where it falls into the damage formula, sitting second in the list right behind Bone and Cyclone armors, and interestingly enough, encountering the same nature of ignoring your resists for calculating the damage. So whether you're positive or negative resist, Energy Shield will function as if you have 0% resistances, meaning 100 damage is 100 damage, even if you're amp damaged or under the effect of salvation. And since Energy Shield works on every normal damage type except poison, yes, all 7 damage types, it can get some serious work done throughout the game, though there are some things that bypass it, like Crushing Blow, Open Wounds, and self-damaging skills like Sacrifice, though how often you encounter these in the wild, it's pretty rare. Now, as far as how much it absorbs, a lot of builds will max it out, since it takes level 40 to reach the hard limit of 95% damage absorb, so you'll only put less if you have methods of reaching that with less points invested, such as high-end memory staffs or a specific skill bump setup. Though don't discount it just because you lack the ability to reach this, or if you just happen to only have a few points to invest, since you hit 50% absorb at level 7 and 75% at level 20, which are both fairly significant amounts, and that's a bit of a reason why it's usually good to kind of invest in Telekinesis first before pumping the shield, unless you're running a very specific build that needs that high shield right away and does not need the mana. Now, with the mana burn fixed in Resurrected, there's not much to worry about there unless you're playing Lord of Destruction, in which case, mana burn is going to wreck your day. So that leaves really only one big misunderstanding to talk about, and that's damage taken goes to mana. The skill has a lot of misunderstandings about it in general, but the basic function of it is restoring mana based on the amount of damage you take, not the other way around. But there is also commonly a misunderstanding about how it works with Energy Shield. The sad reality is, it is based on the damage you actively take to life. So whenever you have high levels of Energy Shield, you're only taking very small amounts of damage to your life, or ideally none in some cases, meaning that damage to mana becomes less and less effective. So generally not recommended to go for a perfect balance between the two effects, though it can be semi-useful if you're running a low-level energy shield as a support skill rather than as a main tanking skill. So I will include a link to the page with a table showing you the percents needed, assuming you have a flat 0% resist to the damage types in question. Personally, I tend to lean a bit more into the prevent all damage approach commonly used in immortal builds. High energy shield, high resist, good incremental damage reduction, and absorb to minimize or even eliminate the actual damage taken. Though this was a common tactic in PvP even before Resurrected, it's just for me the changes that fixed mana burn have made a skill I only use in those specific builds back to a skill I now finally consider an option for most builds, even in PvM. Again, and when paired with warmth or even insight, it can be used with mana-hungry sorceress builds like Novas and stuff like that. So have you tried building an immortal sorceress, or do you prefer to focus solely on damage output? Mention it down below, and if you want to know more about the damage mitigation in detail, click the video on screen now, and as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye. Getting back to what the sorceress is known for, which is flinging spells with reckless abandon, we dive into the frosty depths that serve as an intriguing mirror to the previously covered fire skills. Starting today with the direct hitters, Ice Bolt, Ice Blast, and Glacial Spike, three important and often overlooked tools in the arsenal of the ever-popular Blizzard sorceress. So today we'll look at the three, but also why you may not want to just blindly dump into them as you level. At the bottom of the list we have a fairly overlooked low-level spell, and that is Ice Bolt. It deals kind of low damage at first, but thanks to its synergies and fixed mana cost, it can be a handy pocket tool for some players that lack mana recovery from things such as Insight and a lack of plus skills to things like Warmth. The big reasons why it tends not to be as favored as budget Firebolt are twofold though. One is that it actually lacks one of the perks provided in its upgrades, and that's freeze length, since unlike its big brothers, Ice Bolt only provides a chill instead, and two, unlike Firebolt, even at high levels, it just cannot keep up remotely with the DPS of its bigger siblings, while Firebolt on the other hand can actually surpass its main competitor, Fireball. So generally, people are going to favor going after its big brother, Ice Blast, which at extremely high levels is actually competitive with a lot of single target damage skills, and on pure ice sources will be keeping step with even the big damage dealer Blizzard, albeit trading Area of Effect for precision targeting. This is one reason you'll often see it preferred for support damage against bosses on standard Blizzard sorceresses, though it has lost a little popularity due to the cooldown changes in 2.4. But needless to say, despite its scaling cost, the fact that you'll regularly do several times the damage with it compared to other cold single target spells makes this a bread and butter skill to learn how to use, and it's even better with the icing on top of actually being able to freeze targets you're hitting, provided they're not immune to freeze of course. One catch on them though is that they travel the same speed as Ice Bolt, so you'll want to learn how to lead mobile targets a little bit with them, since they both fly a little slower than the third skill, Glacial Spike. Though Glacial Spike weirdly does still end up playing second fiddle to Blast in a lot of situations, despite the fact that it has a splash effect similar to Fireball, albeit slightly larger, and actually freezes targets just like Ice Blast. So it is a good crowd control without a doubt, and I still keep it on swap for that. The drawback is, it actually falls back to doing about the same amount of damage as Ice Bolt whenever you're fully invested in the skills, it's just to a group instead. All this while costing 4 more mana per cast than the same level Blast results in an issue most players won't notice, and that is that they are sacrificing a lot of damage by just dumbfiring the spell against single targets in between Blizzard casts, when in reality, you only really want to do this against actually significantly sized groups of enemies to hold them in place, but against bosses, groups of 2 or 3 enemies, or anything similar, Glacial Spike will tend to lose out a lot more to blast than a higher level skill really has any reason to, especially since its damage synergy comes from Frozen Orb, and it only gets freeze length from Blizzard. That actually brings up an interesting note on these skills and how they interact with their ultimate level skills and even each other, since while Ice Bolt gets kind of pumped up by everything and anything, the other skills have more specific interactions. For example, Glacial Spike only providing freeze length to blast, and Blizzard only providing freeze length to Glacial Spike, not improving their damage. So if you want to maximize your damage, you want to take this into account, since investing in Glacial Spike after Blizzard instead of Ice Blast will result in long freeze blasts, but kind of junky damage, while investing in Blast first will result in shorter freezes, but far better damage between Blizzards, all while they boost Blizzard all the same. So considering what you want to lean into, it's pretty important to kind of think about this during the leveling phase of any of the builds that use these. So all in all, do you prefer the Area of Effect option to freeze a crowd, or do you prefer letting Blizzard chill the swarm while you snipe things off with Ice Blast? Mention it down below, and if you're curious how these compare to their fire mirrors, check out the video on screen now, and as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye. In Diablo 2, the Blizzard versus Orb argument has been a long-standing one, well, at least since synergies and casting delays were introduced, but with patch 2.4, this changed a bit, since the delays have actually been uncoupled from each other, allowing these former adversaries to cooperate on the same builds, though with the big con of only relying on one element to do all your damage, cutting you off of some farming areas and potential progression. Though that aside, let's look at why you might choose one over the other as a standalone or even a dual elemental option. Starting with the most popular, Blizzard, we have a beast of a spell thanks to synergies that drops a bit over 6 projectiles a second, each dealing massive damage for a cold spell and raining destruction down on a large or stationary enemy pretty easily, especially since you can generally have up to 3 Blizzards out at any given time due to their 4-second duration but only 1.8 second casting delay. Blizzard's main advantages are this sheer damage, its ability to be used as a trap of sorts by casting it and kiting enemies into it, much like Meteor, and whenever you have multiples of them out, you can have a pretty effective death hallway for most enemies, at least the ones that aren't cold immune. And this is why it's so popular for targeted farming throughout the game, since it can absolutely trash groups if you know that they're not going to be cold immune. The drawbacks of Blizzard, though, are pretty hefty as well, since to get this death hallway, you need to be investing heavily into it, a whopping 80 plus skill points, which does cut you off of a lot of secondary elemental damage options, unless you're happy with them being extremely wimpy or something. The other drawback being is that it's a stationary spell. If you miscast it in a location or your aim is bad, you will end up with wasted mana and twiddling your thumbs for almost 2 seconds waiting to drop a new one. That said, once you get used to it, and you know where to run with it, it can be a dangerous force for targeted farming as mentioned earlier. Now, Orb is the flip side of all of this, and despite its relatively low listed damage, it's still no slack in terms of raw punch either, which is why with the new decoupling, people go all in and use it alongside Blizzard, with Blizzard on right click and Orb on the left click providing a powerful 1-2 punch for just an extra 20 points. Though you will find when aimed properly, Orb definitely punches above its weight, especially considering how cheap it is point-wise. This definitely falls into its advantages, since even as a standalone spell, you can get it to max damage with just a bit over 40 points, a few prerequisites, and a couple points into mastery, meaning it is among the most hybrid-friendly skills in the game. And it can even do okay damage without being fully synergized, as long as you don't expect it to be shredding players' 8 endgame enemies in a single shot. This is because, despite for most people only showing up as a few hundred damage, this damage is on a per bolt basis, and it launches 46 of those bolts on an uninterrupted cast, 30 in flight and 16 in the final flourish. By positioning this flourish on top of the target enemy, you will end up doing massive amounts of damage as all the bolts collide with them, which is especially easy against larger enemies like Act bosses. This, and the fact that Orb is a more mobile-friendly skill than Blizzard, is why you'll see Orb Sorceresses doing a lot more repositioning than you would expect to optimize damage. Though one nice thing is, even if you're terrible at aiming with it, you'll still get an okay amount of work done with Orb, since it's a much more new user-friendly skill than Blizzard thanks to the much larger area of effect. That said, some cons do come with the skill. It literally cannot reach the sheer damage of Blizzard, even when fully synergized. It is also just pure cold damage, just like Blizzard, and if you're relying on it as your sole damage dealer, it will feel a bit more lackluster than its compatriot, and you won't even have the other cold spells as backup since you most likely would be using your points elsewhere. This is why a lot of people crap on it, but for progression, it's almost never a mistake to go with Orb plus one other element, since it at least lets you have split elemental tools to allow you to move through every area of the game without being hindered. So, which of these heavy-hitting ice spells do you prefer, and why? Mention it down below, and if you want to know what my favorite skill to pair with Orb is, check out the video on screen now. And as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye. In Diablo 2, there's a bit of a love-hate relationship with the Sorceress Radial skills. Some are universally loved, like Static Field, due to its sheer power. Others are often heavily dismissed, like the misaligned Frost Nova. And then there is the Nova spell itself, which, if you linger around long enough in the community, you'll find people who list it among the worst skills, while others tout it as one of the best. So today we're going to explore these three skills, their uses, and even some extremely common misunderstandings about them. Starting with the oddball of the pack, Frost Nova, the cheaper of the two Nova skills proper, and also the least damaging, though it does come with the perk of chilling enemies. The big problem Frost Nova used to have, and the stigma that still sticks with it, is the fact that it simply does not pack a lot of damage, and there's only a few ways to directly boost cold damage by percent, though this also comes from a bit of a misunderstanding about mechanics, namely the fact that it's pretty easy to ensure that any non-cold immunes are automatically going to be taking double damage from any of your cold skills. This is because the Sorceress has the natural skill of Cold Mastery that reduces the resistances of any non-cold immune drastically, meaning the listed damage on this Nova can easily be listed as double against your enemies you'll be farming against, and makes it an excellent pairing with Frozen Orb or Blizzard for mono-elemental builds, provided you have the mana to keep it up. Though, as with most cold builds, it still does have the drawback of being pretty impotent in areas with lots of cold immunes, like much of Act 5 unfortunately, and with how high cold immunities tend to sit, even with Conviction and lower resist aiding you, you will struggle in those zones. Its cousin, Nova, despite having a very similar graphic, radius, and casting style, and yes, even casting speed, has a sort of inverse situation in many cases. It's much easier to increase the damage of, but a bit more difficult to lower the enemy resists with. Though with the existence of Infinity, and to a lesser degree stuff like Crescent Moon, it's a bit more commonly found and accessible in the wild due to the overwhelming popularity of these items. With 2.4, Nova got some bumps as well, most notably the addition of the Static Field synergy. This increases Nova's maximum damage potential quite a bit, but it also puts it in a similar point range as its frosty cousin, albeit with less prerequisites for its synergies, letting it sit at exactly 60 points to fully optimize. With this higher damage, it's able to protect you fairly easily by causing reaction locks, and while not as consistent as Chill, it's still more than enough to keep you alive in the fray. Like Frost Nova, this is very often combined with similar elemental skills though, in this case usually Energy Shield and Telekinesis though, with remaining points going into Warmth to keep you topped off. This can lead to a similar issue, but with lightning immunes being hard to deal with, but due to the lower general lightning resist on lightning immunes, you will find getting enemies into actually destroyable ranges to be much simpler, doubly so if you use a self-wielded Infinity. Though this does come with a slower casting speed than most more well-known 200 faster cast rate variants of this build. But you will find it much more consistent for difficulty-wide clears, especially if you give your mercenary insight for mana. The last of the three, and easily the most complicated, is Static Field, a skill that will not kill anything, but that pretty much every sorceress will grab at least 1 point in for utility. This is because it is essentially a magical Crushing Blow effect, removing a % of the enemy's life. However, unlike Crushing Blow, this works at full efficiency even at a range, and more importantly, it scales with player count, unlike Crushing Blow. This means that 25% is 25% of current life, not base life values. Now, where Static gets fiddly is in its interactions with Lightning Resist, Conviction, and minus enemy Lightning Resist from gear, since it deals this % damage in Lightning, and it doesn't bypass resists. On the simplest side, if the enemy has positive Lightning Resist after everything is taken into account, it would behave like you think it does. The enemy resistances reduce the damage by that amount. It's fairly straightforward. Where it gets wobbly is whenever you start moving into negative resistances. If Conviction or lower resist reduce an enemy's resistances to negative numbers, and there are no other factors in play, then Static Field will do its flat 25% damage and not concern itself with things other than that. However, if you have equipment reducing the enemy lightning resist into the negatives, it will increase it. This means if you get the enemy to negative 100% lightning resist without using Conviction, then you'll deal a 50% damage hit. Now, when you combine these, it gets really weird, and there's a whole formula for it, since if Conviction is dropping them to, say, negative 20%, and you have a minus 100% from gear, you'll only do a little under 43% damage on a hit because Conviction and lower resist are eating up a bit of the functionality. If you want to see how the chart looks and the formula, I'll be sure to include a link in the description below, which also has some interesting tables related to how weird the Nightmare and Hell limits actually are, since the 33% limit in Nightmare and the 50% limit in Hell, for how low you can take them, is a limit on when the spell can affect them, not a limit on how much damage they can take. So there are situations in Hell difficulty where you can drop things down to nearly a quarter of their life. Thankfully, plus lightning damage is a lot simpler with Static Field though, because it does nothing to it. You just never have to worry about it in that regard. It does literally nothing. All that said though, do you love or hate Nova? And how often do you use Static Field? Mention it down below, and as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye. As we near the end of the Sorceress Skill list, we have the direct damage lightning skills that you will find yourself spamming into the face of demons, undead, and corrupted beasts all across Sanctuary. Namely, Charge Bolt, Lightning, and Chain Lightning. And if you're new to the game, you'll be wondering why two of them feel so much slower than other spells of the same tier. And well, that's because Lightning is special. Though to make it a bit confusing, it's only certain lightning skills that are that way, namely Chain Lightning and, well, Lightning. This is because these spells use a unique spellcasting animation compared to most other spells you'll encounter, though in a way most people won't recognize. Namely, they have the same action frame as other spells, just a longer post-cast animation. So if you cast a Fireball on the 5th frame of the animation, you'd cast Lightning on the 5th frame as well. It's just that you might take 4 frames to recover from the Fireball, but take 9 frames to recover from Lightning. Another interesting quirk of these two lightning skills is that the synergies only apply to maximum damage, not minimum. Meaning that as you dump points into their related skills, you will see the maximum skyrocket, but the only way you'll improve the minimum damage is by pushing your mastery up, though the difference that makes to your average is pretty minimal. As far as these two big ticket lightning spells kinda go, they both have their uses, with Chain Lightning being oddly enough a bit lower priority, despite being the higher level skill. This is mostly due to its damage scaling and mana cost, which results in it doing far less damage to individual targets than its lower level companion, while also costing drastically more to cast. The reason for this drastic difference is because Chain Lightning is much more fire and forget. You can spam it and clear out swarms of enemies relatively easily as long as you hit something in the crowd, since it will automatically bounce among the valid targets, at least until it bounces to a certain limit. And it is worth noting that what you see is not always what you get with this skill, especially on older versions of the game, since the bounces you see are not always the bounces that happen in the actual code. That said, as you get more practice with the lightning skills, you will find that standard lightning will generally be your bread and butter out of the two skills, since it deals drastically higher damage for much cheaper. And once you get practice kiting the enemies into a line like you would do with something like Bone Spear, you'll find it's exceptional at decimating enemies along the way, since it stops for nothing short of a wall. This damage difference becomes much more apparent as you start dumping into synergies alongside them, since as we covered in the Mastery video, these boosts are applied before Mastery, creating a multiplier effect considering Lightning's base damage and growth rate from the synergies are drastically higher than that of Chain Lightning. And if that wasn't enough, instead of working on next delay, like Chain does, Plain Lightning uses Last Collide, which means when moving through a pack of enemies, it can toggle through them, sometimes hitting the same target more than once, especially if they're clumped really tight together. Now, the third spell of this episode, thankfully, is not nearly as fiddly as those two, and that is Charge Bolt, which thankfully doesn't have any weird casting speed offsets or weird next delays or such on the missiles, or even weird conditions on how synergies affect it. Though, much like the Amazon Charge Strike, this shotgun of a spell can be stacked on a single target, making it able to do some gnarly point-blank damage since it can cast up to 24 bolts into a single target with perfect positioning, and even without that, you can still get a solid number of them stacking up. And since Charge Bolt's minimum damage is scaling and is impacted by masteries, it can scale to some really solid average damage numbers against isolated targets, unlike its big brothers. And even just be used as a reliable area of effect spell too, since it can sweep out a lot of softer targets without much of an issue thanks to the ability to blanket a field with these more moderate but consistent damage numbers. So, have you ever ran a Lightning Sorceress? If so, did you go for the straight-firing Lightning Queen or more of the Shockwave Nova style? Mention it down below, and as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye. In Diablo 2, there's plenty of skills that get called overpowered, broken, etc. But one that is the source of probably the most arguments and debates is the teleport skill of the Sorceress. So today we're going to talk about this skill's functions, how you can obtain it on other classes, and even the alternatives and their limitations found on other characters. Starting off, the skill itself, Teleport is exactly what it sounds like, a spell that lets you move from point A to point B instantaneously, whether you can actually see what's at the target location or not, just as long as you can click on it and it's not a wall or out of bounds, and honestly sometimes you can even teleport into those walls or out of bounds, but that's only in specific locations. As far as its mechanics, it starts out costing 24 mana and reduces by 1 for each additional level in it, so it gets kinda cheap at the higher levels, but in spite of this, it's still generally best to treat it as a one-point wonder, since it lacks any synergies and does not gain any functionality other than cost reduction with growth. When you teleport, regardless of level, it will bring any mercenaries or summons you have to your new location, and the way it spawns you all at the same spot can actually protect certain summoner builds from non-piercing ranged attacks, as well as refocusing all summons AIs onto the closest target in a technique called telestomping. The telestomping technique is used for quite a few builds in the game, and not just summoners, the most popular being found on druids, necromancers, and paladins because, well, they can use landing on top of the enemy to their greatest effect. But there are a few uses for things like sorceresses, though they're mostly fringe situations. And while this is a dominant strategy, most people ignore it and focus solely on the functionality of teleport strictly as a movement technique to reach bosses faster in many situations, though the sheer value of it is often overstated outside of characters that are capable of exploiting these telestomps or for classes that lack natural movement techniques. As far as where you can get it for non-sorceresses, the most popular is obviously Enigma, since it is the only off-class skill source for the spell, at least in terms of actual skill levels, though it is far from the only option, with weapons like Spell Steal and Naj's Puzzler having natural charges of the spell, as well as of teleportation suffixes that can be found on orbs, staves, amulets, and circlets, even rare ones, with amulets being especially desirable due to working well with a number of endgame sets. Now, the last important thing to remember with teleport itself, and this is one that most people miss, is that you teleport on the action frame, and then have recovery animations in the new location. So for characters like the Necromancer Vampire form, if you're using a rare amulet for this, or even certain types of Amazon equipment setups, you'll find teleporting feels a lot different than it does on characters with more standard casting animations like the Sorceress, Paladin, or Barbarian. This is because of where the action frames fall in the total casting animation, which can make them faster to teleport once, but longer between chain teleports. With all that said, there are actually a decent number of alternatives to teleport, and there are also effective places to farm for where you don't have to have teleport or even these movement techs. Starting with the alternatives, you have Leap and Leap Attack on the Barbarian, which functions similar to teleport but requires line of sight and cannot go through solid walls, but it can go through some grates. On the Paladin, you have Charge, which lets you just cover ground exceptionally quickly and easily without having to dip into tons of faster run walk, and the Assassin, you have Dragon's Flight, which is somewhere in between the last two, since you can go across gaps similar to Leap, but you need an enemy to target to get there, so it can be a little bit fiddly, though you do have bursts of speed to keep moving fairly quickly even after that. Now, druids, Amazons, and necromancers sadly do not have solid alternatives and will need to keep an eye out for teleport staves, circlets, or amulets, or if they have the resources, grab an Enigma for the teleporting goodness. That said, even if you don't want to use teleport or can't use teleport, there are plenty of other places to farm. The Travancore and Cow levels are two of the most obvious, as are Pindleskin and Worldstone Keep, since they're all quick and straightforward places to farm where teleport really does not add any or much value. Chaos is similar, but getting across the river bridges skills is helped out a bit by teleport or by other movement techs, since you want to get to the actual sanctuary to get the decent boss density. But beyond these, unless you're farming uniques or sets, which while a valid goal, you're usually better off going for kill volume, not just popping the high value targets, since by killing more enemies, you'll generally get better odds of getting those runes, those item bases, the jewels, charms, etc., than you will simply going around popping each of the uniques in all of the level 85 areas that results in people favoring teleport so much more. And this is especially important for item bases, especially if you want the higher level ones such as Monarch Shields, Phase Blades, Caduceus, etc. So what are some of your favorite builds that do not use Teleport or Enigma? Are any of them in your top 10? Mention it down below, and as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye. Today, we're going to talk about the 2 worst skills in Diablo 2, why they're so bad, and unlike most of the other skill videos, we're going to talk about some of the options on how they could fix them in future patches. Though starting out, let's talk about why Inferno and Blue Raspberry Inferno, commonly called Arctic Blast, are so terrible. Basically, in spite of their improvements in 2.4, they still suffer from a few mechanical pains in the butt, such as being size 1 missiles, which are tiny, in fact much tinier than the graphic would lead you to believe. They also lock you in place while you're firing them, and they still lack the raw damage to properly compensate for all of this, since they open you up to way too much damage. Starting with Arctic Blast, we have the cold damage version, which thankfully does chill effects and isn't even that terrible of a duration, though it's also not godly either. With each level, it increases its range, which isn't that bad, but due to the small missiles, chances are, even at a full screen's distance, and even with the chill, at least some of a pack of enemies will reach you due to the limited width of the skill and, well, lackluster damage in general. Similarly, Inferno got a bump to damage in 2.4, albeit with fire damage instead of cold, so no chill there. Even with the reduced mana cost, it's generally still going to have the same issues and drawbacks as its Druid Mirror, though it does shoot at least a little bit further, though not so much that you'd notice. Generally speaking, these are still the 2 worst skills in the game, but also sadly the 2 hardest to balance due to how they function, since if you make them powerful enough to justify standing still, then chances are they will become as strong as meta options, despite being level 6 skills. If you don't make them powerful enough to justify standing still, then you need to think of an alternative besides just sheer damage to a single stream path to make them useful. Personally, there's a few options that could be considered, but I think the best update for them would be to increase the area of effect with levels, and a number of mods have approached this with a burning hands approach, turning it into an ever-expanding fan of fire as you gain levels in it, much like the multi-shot Balrog or Flayer Shaman, and it works, at least until things get weird at exceptionally long ranges, but even then it's okay. But weirdly, while that works for Inferno as a solid patch, a potential middle ground option, so we don't have to spray and pray fire and ice shotguns in the game, would be to actually scale the missile size and of course even more damage with levels, which would keep the firing my laser appeal of Inferno as it currently is for some people, while still giving it a lot more utility to deal with at least small crowds. So what do you think should be done with the worst skills in Diablo 2? Mention it down below, and maybe they'll get some ideas to at least make it competitive with, well, at least level 1 skills. And as always, keep gaming, have fun, and peace out. This has been Alzorath. Bye.